Good afternoon, and welcome to the Way to Wow Show, People Making Money. I am your host, Kevin Bemmel, here every week on Wednesday, 12:30 Pacific time, 3:30 p.m. on the East Coast, and then, an hour in for the two internal time zones. Hopefully we can all figure that out. I think one day I'm going to have to do a show just about how time zones came into being. But we're not gonna spend time on that today. Really, what I want to do is get right to our guest on the show today, Dr. Jennifer. I got my tongue over my eye teeth. I can't see what I'm saying. Dr. Jennifer Spielman. Jennifer is an associate professor of history at the Merchant Marine Academy in Great Neck, New York. That's out on Long Island, for those of you who are from the New York area. What we in the Jewish world call the old country. Great Neck is a big, large community of Jewish people there. So Jennifer, welcome to the show. Welcome to the Way to Wow Show, People Making Money. So nice to have you on the show.
Good. Thank you so much for the invitation, Kevin. I really appreciate it.
And I should also mention, Jennifer is the vice president of the Society for Military History. And is it another year you'll be fleeting up to president, right?
Another year. We have a 2-year apprenticeship as vice president, and then ready to take the reins as president for 2 years. So I've been working towards that and having a fantastic experience with that.
Yeah, so that's kind of like how it works in naval aviation. If you're at a squadron, you're the XO for 2 years, and then when the squadron CO leaves, you fleet up to the CO position, and you get that kind of mentoring for the 2 years you're in the number 2 slot. It's really quite nice. Good experience way to make it work. So. Just a little side note, as a Navy chaplain, one of the billets we are at least technically eligible for is the chaplain billet at the Merchant Marine Academy. And I remember early on in my career talking to the detailer, because I thought, wow, wouldn't it be fantastic to go to, this service academy that I honestly didn't really know that much about. I mean, you hear about the Naval Academy, everybody knows Annapolis. And they said, well, not too many Jewish sailors at the Merchant Marine Academy, probably not the best place for us to put a rabbi, where you'll have like 4 or 5 people. And there's also a huge, Jewish community right there that they can access. I'm like, shoot.
I know the first time I was in the chapel at Kings Point, I did not realize they have a very unique altar which rotates. So it has 3 different rotations depending on who's worshiping in the chapel. Wow. So I would invite the next time you're in New York to come by because it really is quite a unique chapel and it's very beautiful.
Yeah, I'd love to. Well, so now let's get to you. And as I mentioned, in the email exchange we had talking about the show, you're in academia, and I in talking to people, I think academia still carries a certain cachet in terms of a career, somewhat unattainable to a lot of people, and so let's go kind of back to the beginning, and as a child, what did you have professional aspirations, and if so, what were they?
Yeah, and what's interesting, I think probably also as a federal employee, I should say initially that these are, of course, all my views, and certainly not the views of the federal government or the Department of Transportation. But I was reflecting and really thinking on my career, as when you invited me to talk about me today. And one of the things that occurred to me is that, as a child, I wasn't really exposed to anyone as a professor. My family was not kind of in that career realm. But what they did do for me, my mom worked in a bank. My dad was a food service director at a local high school. But what they did allow me to do is really encourage me to pursue individual interests. And the thing, of course, I loved most growing up was reading. And I am a little fuzzy, even when I look back on that. it came very naturally. And then all of a sudden I was somehow in an advanced reading class. And then I had grandparents who lived very close by, maternal grandparents, who were absolutely encouraging me in all of that. And so it was just, there wasn't an expectation necessarily that I would go into academics, but that I would be encouraged to look at my interest and, intellectual curiosities, and anything that came up, we would be encouraged. And I have many memories. My grandmother, I stayed with her during the summer while my mom was working, and we would walk down to the library, and she would, ask me about different books. And I do have such grateful memories of my time with her, because she was one of 5 children in the Great Depression, and she was the only one of the 5 who graduated from high school at the time. And she always took great pride in that and really encouraged me academically and intellectually. So I just had a very strong relationship with her. But then they also were very firm believers in kind of understanding our country's history and traveling to visit different historical sites and sort of understanding that. And I grew up in central Pennsylvania, just outside of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And we would regularly take trips to Gettysburg National Battlefield. My grandfather would take us to Philadelphia, and we see the Liberty Bell. So that was sort of a part of growing up, just being aware historically and being encouraged, but not necessarily at that point. Like I never thought, oh, I'm going to go into, to college or anything at all like that. And I thought maybe teach elementary school, maybe middle school, and then maybe high school. So it kind of changed as I continued. But I do just give extraordinary credit to that kind of very nurturing intellectual environment. And in some ways, the funny thing, my grandmother almost, she did not work outside the home, but she was always my sort of biggest supporter when I sort of made different decisions. She was always a fan and always encouraging me, and that I'm very, very grateful for that. But I think she had that intellectual drive too, but because of the time period she grew up in, it was sort of limited, but she was very proud of her high school diploma.
Yeah. Interesting that's where your intellectual curiosity started. And that historically, I think that has been the case. I know, examining the careers of 2, very well-known Army generals, Dwight Eisenhower and George Patton, both of them read voraciously, even starting as children, and much of their whatever academic success they had came from that base of having read, so many books. So what kind of books did you read as a child?
I was devoted to the Nancy Drew series and the mysteries. I read all of her books. And I remember one time, and I know it's awful to say because some of these bookstores are not there anymore, but I think it was Walden Books or B. Dalton Books. There used to be a little bookstore like in the mall. But anyways, we would go, and of course, every time we would go, my grandma would, oh, do you need a new one? And I would come home with one, and my mother would get very sort of upset. Like, don't, you're spoiling her. And my grandmother said, you never spoil a child by buying them a book. So she was very adamant about that. But I love the Nancy Drew series. And then I read all the Little House on the Prairie series. That was, read very quickly. And then the Black Stallion series, like absolutely devoured. And I did not realize this until I moved up to New York, to Long Island, and my son, started reading. So my son's 13 now. I didn't realize though that the Black Stallion series is set on the North Shore of Long Island, and that the track where the Black, I guess, right, runs and races is Belmont Racetrack. And so I was just kind of excited, like, oh, like I'm living very close to there. So, but I don't know. I mean, they were some historical, but there was some mystery, and I just kept going. I just never quite stopped with that. And then, as I got into high school, more and more kind of history interested me, and that was a really area where I started to kind of develop more interest. And a lot of it started with the Civil War, but then expanded. And then by the time I graduated from college, which interestingly enough, I had a degree in education. I decided, and you think, I guess, about certain points where you make decisions. So the initial plan was that I would get a degree in English language arts and, teach middle school or high school. And then my junior year, I had a military history class, naval history class, with a female professor named Carol Reardon. We are still to this day keep in touch and are close. And she's a former president of the Society for Military History. So I like to think the legacy is continuing. But she was an incredible role model and mentor for me and encouraged me to look to graduate school. And that was really the first time I had ever sort of thought about continuing after college. I mean, just wasn't in the plan before that. And she's like, no, I think, this would be a really great opportunity for you. And so she was a great mentor for me. The funniest thing, of course, about it was I still had no idea at that point that this was sort of a predominantly male dominated field. I enjoyed it, and I saw her as a role model, but when I got to graduate school then in Philadelphia at Temple University, I looked around the room and we had a class of 30 in that class. And I was the only female graduate student in military history. And that was sort of the first moment it dawned on me, like, oh, this is interesting. I didn't expect this, but you just kind of roll with it. But the Temple University, I was familiar with Philadelphia. We had traveled there and visited there. But also at the time, Dr. Russell Weigley, who is a very well-known military historian. He's since passed, but he was one of the chief advisors there. And I had gone to interview and meet with him and just felt he was very supportive and had a great intellectual background, but also a wonderful relationship with his graduate students. And as I came to learn later on, though, some graduate programs were very, very competitive, were very sort of cutthroat, were, who's going to be first, who's going to be last. And he would have none of that. It was a collaborative relationship with all the students. We were working together on projects. We were helping each other out. Everyone had different strengths and weaknesses, but you don't always know this up front. But later on in my career, I began to understand what an important role he played defining the culture there, and one which could have been, again, as the only female in that kind of culture, could have been very challenging, but was a very collaborative and supportive relationship. So that's sort of the step from central Pennsylvania to eastern Pennsylvania to begin that program. And that was just an incredible intellectual experience, because at that point then, it's not just the classroom, but it's the entire city that now becomes a way to learn more about history. And Philadelphia was just a wonderful opportunity for me.
Absolutely. So I want to take just a little bit of, you mentioned a couple of times that you thought, well, maybe you teach elementary school or junior high school, something. Why? And it doesn't sound like teaching at the university level or the college level was on the, agenda. So why, the, primary and secondary school level, but not, the higher education level? I mean, and I'm curious to know, was that in part because you're female, or did that not really have anything to do with it?
Yeah, I think there was a mix of that. I think one, I just didn't have a lot of exposure. My mother had graduated high school, she had not gone to college, so there wasn't a lot of exposure with that. And then I do have a very clear memory, and I tell my female midshipmen all the time about this. I walked into the guidance counselor's office at high school and I said, oh, I'm kind of thinking maybe about teaching. She said, oh, that sounds good. We'll get your schedule set up. No need to worry about calculus, because you're certainly not going to need that. And man, I look back on that and think, not good. Like, to assume a woman wasn't going to need those kind of math skills. And I mean, maybe I would have, maybe I wouldn't have, but I would, those are the things that you don't think of in the time. The guidance counselor is telling you this and you're thinking this, but I think, looking at career possibilities. The one subject that I was very interested in was historic preservation, but I did not have the science. You have to have a very rigorous science background to go into restoration and preservation and architecture. And I had none of that. So that, even though I was interested, that career door sort of was closed to me. And I do tell my female midshipmen, you don't know where you're going to go in the future, but you want to be well prepared for any eventuality. And I do have some regrets, I think, about that. I would have, maybe liked to have gone in that direction a little bit, but you learn from that. But I think there was some issues of gender involved.
Yeah, my daughter will be starting high school this coming fall, and so we went and toured the school she's going to go to, and it is interesting. there was a very, very heavy emphasis on college preparation. And for whatever reason, my daughter, at least up till now, has expressed a desire not to go to college. She's much more interested in, starting a business, that kind of thing. And I raised that question, to the people giving the tour, and it was like, click on the light bulb, that they're not everybody here may be college bound. And interestingly enough, they have a very robust sort of, I don't want to call it technological, but they have all kinds of more sort of almost trade oriented programs as well, that are available. And, it begs the question of, high schools in general. I wonder how they're dealing with that issue now.
Absolutely. And I think you're right on about that, because, after World War II, we saw this great expanse of higher education and, great need for college professors, because so many more students were coming into to college. I wonder now if we're actually going to see a contraction of that because of the price point, which is rising. But also, as kind of younger people, my own son's thinking about this, thinking about what's the best path towards a career that they do enjoy. And maybe it's not so much a traditional, college path. So I myself, for my son, try to keep a very open mind about all sorts of possibilities and how you accomplish that. And also recognize that, my own sort of circuitous path, in some ways I kind of kept going, like I didn't stop, but I kept going. But I also never really was thinking this is the job I want to do. It was always more, I was sort of like intellectually interested, and let's give it a shot. Let's try it out and see what happens. And then I sort of look back on this thinking, oh my gosh, I got like a lot of times I was in the right place at the right time. But I know that there have been, it's very difficult in terms of hiring, full-time hiring like today. So I don't know that I think there are a lot of different options today for younger people. And, but I was interested. I, wanted to pursue that and just kind of see where it would take me. And I just sort of kept going, because initially the plan was I would just get a master's degree, and that was a 2-year, 30 credit program. That I would just do that and then look for a job after that. And the interesting thing, because you had asked me 2 questions about like decision moments, different 2 paths before you, and how do you choose the path? So I'd finished my master's degree at Temple University at a wonderful time. I actually met a very nice graduate student there, my husband, and so it was nice to kind of share. We had similar interests, and he was also in the history program, so we kind of moved through and got engaged. And I was offered a job at the Pennsylvania State Archives, and I had done an internship there. I enjoyed that sort of, it's a little bit more public history program, very much so. We had a number of genealogists who would come in, and I worked with them, many of them looking at, for Civil War ancestors. And I really enjoyed my time there. And, so here was the offer, because they did want you to have a master's degree in history. So I checked that off the list, and, thought, okay, am I going to do this? Or we're going to move home, kind of start this new phase. And then I got the letter that I'd been accepted into the PhD program at Temple, and that they had approved funding, so a teaching assistantship. So I would get some funding to continue that. So the master's I sort of paid for myself, but then there was funding opportunities. And I thought at that point, well, don't let the gift horse in the mouth. I got to try it, see what happens. But I do laugh looking back on it too. Again, so the funding was $15,000 a year, and that seems so small at the time, but it meant, I didn't have a car. I was living in the city. Like I could pay for rent and food, and I wanted to give it a shot. So I declined the full-time job offer with the state of Pennsylvania, and much to my mother's dismay, because she wanted me to come back closer to there. I mean, we're still pretty close, but and just decided to keep going on that. So it was kind of unknown path, but I felt like I wasn't ready. I wanted to take the opportunity. I wanted to see where it was going to lead me. So I guess a little bit of risk taking as well, but I just knew that I really enjoyed that, and I've been having a great time. Part of the graduate funding was that I was in the classroom quite a bit. I was grading student exams, so the professor would teach, and then I would do small review sessions and breakout, sessions with the students. But then I was also the primary grader of all the exams and quizzes and things. So, but I enjoyed it. I had a great time. Philadelphia is a very diverse city, still is today, of course. And to have that kind of exposure and with the students, and also just get them excited about some of the history classes, and the classes that were always full were the World War II class and the Civil War class. And there was sort of a waiting list. I mean, because there were more students who wanted to take it than there were seats. And just kind of seeing that intellectual excitement, and it's just fun to be a part of that and be involved in that. And many of them had, ancestors who had served, or just curious, or a lot of personal family stories that came out of that, and they just wanted to learn more about that and connect to their past in that way. So it was a very exciting opportunity. Again, I had no idea where I was going to go, but I kept with it. There were many of us in that initial class of 30 who did not graduate with the degree. So we typically had like 3 years of classwork, and then you had original research and a dissertation to write, somewhere in the 200 to 300 page range. And that typically took another 2 years, maybe sometimes 3 years to finish. And a lot of people dropped off at that point because you had to be self-disciplined and do your research and do the drafts, and all that was sort of on you. And I do give extraordinary credit. My husband and I were married at the time now, both going through the program together, and we sort of kept each other, moving forward, and didn't want to give up on that. And I know how hard that he had worked, and he was supporting me. So we really blessed in that regard too, to kind of keep us going. I mean, we had almost no money between us, but we were determined to finish it, and it was a priority for both of us. So we, I guess about 30%, maybe there were about 10 of us who did graduate from that class of 30.
So, during the 3 years you're going through the PhD program, you were also, you said, a teaching assistant. I assume you were teaching undergraduates.
Yes.
Right. So, where was the stimulus, if you will, for continuing on? Because I can imagine that, so many professions, there is an element of almost boredom, or not boredom is the wrong word, sameness, right?
Yes.
People talk about how exciting, for example, the film business is, and then you invite them to a film set, and you see how much time is spent doing what appears to be nothing. It's can be mind-numbingly dull on a set. So, and I think most professions have that aspect. So where did the impetus come from to stay engaged, to keep undergraduates engaged, all of that part of it?
Yeah. And with like the schedule, so what would happen is I would TA an undergraduate class during the day, because they would have their day classes. Then that was usually like 3 days a week. And then our graduate classes were at night. So we had classes either from like 5 to 7 or 7 to 9. So our classes were at night. And then also on kind of top of that, to pay the rent, typically a lot of people worked part-time. So I was working part-time. Actually, this is a very interesting point, at the Philadelphia Jewish Archive Center.
Oh, wow.
Which has recently, like very recently, just moved into Temple University's main library collection, which is really exciting because I think they have a tremendous program there. But so I would work there probably, I don't know, maybe 10, depending, hours a week, but so there was kind of the work aspect of it, the undergraduate responsibilities, and then your own graduate work. And I, again, just credit so much the kind of leadership at Temple in the history department was very collaborative. So after class, at 9 o'clock at night, there was a little Irish pub down the street, and we would usually gather there. So the other students were supporting you. You were interested in what they were working on. We formed a graduate student association, which was a great help to kind of keep people moving forward with that. They're actually still today, it's called the Barnes Club, and they have a graduate student conference each year where they have, not just the Philadelphia colleges, but from all over the country, to present research and to get feedback. So we came together to help each other out. Again, extraordinary, emotional and intellectual support from my husband at that point. And the fact that every day was so different, and you came away from all of it thinking like, wow, I learned this today, or I learned that today. And that was really powerful for us. So it it was definitely sort of the life of the mind. If we could pay the rent and buy the groceries, that was great. And it's funny because my son just had a career fair in his middle school. So again, like seventh graders, 12, 13-year-old. And the question they kept asking me was about money. And I kind of had to laugh a little bit because in the entire time we were in Philadelphia, money it wasn't really part of it. It was like we were just enjoying the experience so much. And like, oh, at some point we are going to have to get a real job, and maybe we should have planned a little bit better. But it really wasn't, it was not the central feature. And then some of the students, at the middle school look very disappointed, and they're, that's not what they want to talk about. So I am interested how, this kind of younger generation, they are looking at, what's the financial part of this. And when I say to them, like, I never even thought about it, they can't believe it, but it's really actually true. That was not a major priority for us. And we just wanted to make sure we could pay the rent and all that. But it was just that engagement and that kind of social aspect. And to be totally honest, we had finished the program and we're like, okay, we're not going to be in Philadelphia anymore. So we were looking for other jobs. And I had like tears running down my face when we left, because it was and I look back on that, and it was such a special time, in our lives to have that. But, you do progress in your career with more, decision making and things like that. But then I was very fortunate. I received an offer to teach in a college, and it was the Military College of South Carolina. It was the Citadel, and this is a state college in South Carolina, but they do have a regimental and military system in place. All of the students there are in the ROTC program. They do not all go into the active duty military, though, after they graduate. About a third. I say about a third would go into that, but they were all ROTC and they were in uniform and regimented. And, so I kind of entered that. And that was, it was the first time I've been out of Pennsylvania. I was headed south, and this opportunity, and the first memory I had of South Carolina is they had just discovered through the funding with Clive Kessler, they just discovered the CSS Hunley, the Confederate submarine, had just been discovered, and there were several remains of Confederate sailors on board, and they had a funeral at Magnolia Cemetery, complete with like every reenacting group, in South Carolina, and as far as I could get. And there were, women wearing black veils and funeral procession and horse-drawn. That's what we were like, what's going on here? So all of a sudden, it was a whole new venue. But again, the students there were tremendous. And I had not worked, I worked with kind of an urban undergraduate population, and now I was going to a southern student population, and they were tremendous. I was learning so much from them, and I again, very, very positive memories there. So that was sort of how I, got into the college aspect of that. And we were there for about 9 years and spent quite a bit of time in South Carolina.
So so you went from, mid-Atlantic
urban
to mid-Atlantic urban, and then now and civilian.
Yes.
And now all of a sudden, not only are you in a very different culture, the South, but you're also in the military culture as well.
Yes.
So how was that transition, which you were making, and you're making a professional transition as well, right? So 3 transitions, if you will, happening at the same time.
Yes. And of the, I'm trying to think the exact number now, there were maybe about 125, 126 faculty members at the Citadel. It has about 2,000, around 2,000 in the student body. So it's a fairly small college. But of the 126, I would say there were about 6 female faculty members at that college. So that was also, kind of a different environment. I think, for me,
sorry to interrupt you. Did the Citadel admit women at that time, or is this before they admitted women?
So they had just started. So that was like 1991. Okay. The first female members showed up, and I was not there at the time. So I was down in 2001. So that's when I started there. So it had been about 10 years. However, many of the faculty who had sort of been through that talked about the extreme challenges, for the students, for the female students, for the rest of the student body. There was quite a media tension on everything, in and out. And there were protests both supporting the female midshipmen. There were protests against the female midshipmen. There was the administration was spending a lot of money on legal fees to deny female admission. So the alumni, it was just a very, very tumultuous time. And so by the time I got there, about 10 years later, there were close to, I would say, about 8% female students. So it had that first 10 years, but there were still challenges. There were still a lot of challenges with that. And I think, as I had a great female mentor professionally, I was hoping that I could also provide sort of mentorship as a female faculty member there. Although I would have to say many, many times I had male midshipmen who just for whatever reason found they could talk to me about things. And so I was hoping that I would be, a mentor for them as well. And one of the issues that came up at that particular college was many students had parents who would come there, grandparents who would come there. There was sort of a family legacy involved. And then I had students who said, this is not what I want, though. This is what the family wants, but not what I want. And how do I tell them that this is not what I want? And many difficult conversations there. So again, hoping also to keep in mind, for my own son that children need to make individual decisions about where they want to go. But there was a very strong support, the community, I always tell this story, and the students find this hard to believe, but so every Friday afternoon, the regiment would have a parade in the afternoon, and typically you would get somewhere around 600 or 700 members of the community who would show up to support the students and be there at that event. And so the town gown relationship down there was extraordinary because there was great support for the school and for its history and for the midshipmen. And that sort of looking at that, and as again the initial kind of protest aspect subsided, as we had amazing female midshipmen who came in, that sort of translated into great community support, and that made a big difference, because even though it was a difficult and challenging program, to know that the community was coming to support them, and it had a very special place in Charleston, in the hearts of Charlestonians there. And I talk about they had a holiday concert, the regimental band and the choir, and did a concert. They had to extend the concert to 3 days because there was standing room only, because so many people would come to support that. And that was a very special aspect about that school. And not all colleges have that, but you could definitely see that. So I think that was a great learning lesson for me, to see how important it is for students to feel valued, and that the work they're doing is really appreciated, both from their faculty members outside of classes and also the community at large. So it was a wonderful, wonderful experience. I really enjoyed that. And we were there again about 9 years. And that's then we had our son at the very end of that. And then the question about how do you move closer to family, how do you balance that? And then, of course, one of the other difficult decisions professionally is, for both, men and women, how do you balance the family work life, and how do you find balance for that? And at that time, we had family in the Northeast, and, in balancing all of that, it seemed sort of like the right time to come up. And, the federal government, I always like to joke that the federal government, made us an offer we couldn't refuse, but we were very excited about the opportunity to join the team at the Merchant Marine Academy. And the offer, I was extended an offer as a professor. In addition, my husband was also extended a tenure track position as a professor. And that's the other thing for folks who are perhaps not as familiar with the higher education. There is, in fact, a two-tiered employment system. And one is called a tenure track professor, who has job security, health benefits, retirement, and that you are teaching, consistently. And then there is sort of this like adjunct professor, which is a more part-time professor. If you have extra classes that you need filled, but we're just pay you per class, and we won't extend to you sort of full benefits. And that still continues today, and
Yeah.
is a challenge, I think, shall we say. And so when, that the federal government was willing to extend both, tenure track full-time positions to both my husband and myself, we felt like that was a really important professional move, and then also allowed us to balance kind of the family time with our son, who's quite young, he was 2 at the time, to balance that in a way that hopefully was good for him and for us, and also for our careers at the same time. But that's a challenging piece of all of this, especially when they're quite young.
So, and I may be wrong about this, but my sense of academia is for a married couple, for both spouses to be able to get a job, even in the same city, let alone at the same college or university, would seem to me to be pretty unusual. How were you able to, because I take it your husband taught at the Citadel as well. So how were you able to work that out, both going to the Citadel and then, going from there to the Merchant Marine Academy?
I think the technical odds are 1,000,000 to 1, pretty much on that. So my husband he had worked at the College of Charleston when we were in Charleston. He was there, again, what they call a visiting professor. So he was not a full-time professor, but he had so many extra students that they needed additional classes taught. And since I had the tenure track position and I had the health insurance, right, that was the important aspect of this. Because even by this time, even they're like, oh, we're not really worried about money, like we are now. Like, we need to have a mortgage, we need to have a house, and we need to have a car, and we need to have health insurance. So it was fine because I had sort of been able to have that. So he had taught at the College of Charleston and enjoyed that very much. But then, as we want to see, both of our careers progress and advance, and there are limitations to that. So there are only certain classes you're going to teach, and that becomes more challenging. We had put 9 years into that, and we're sort of ready for the next step. And again, sometimes it's like you're just at the right time in the right place. It's hard to explain. Sometimes maybe you're just guided there. But at that point, there were these hiring cycles come in waves, because oftentimes they're hiring several people who are fairly young, and then they kind of make their way through the department and sort of retire at a similar time. And that's what was happening. There's a very large turnover at the Merchant Marine Academy at that time period. A number of professors had retired, and one of them had taught American history, which I taught, and American military history and naval history. And then the other one had taught world history and European history, and that was my husband's field. So it was 1,000,000 to 1 odds, but again, we were like, let's take a chance here. Let's see what's going to happen. And so we come up. I got the job offer. The other faculty member was retiring. There was a job search for that, and I started in July, and then sort of that following June, he had applied and he got the other position. So it was quite a moment. I really will never forget that moment, because we couldn't quite believe it, but we were just thrilled beyond belief to have had that opportunity. And actually, one of the nicest things one of my colleagues said to me, and because I always do worry about this, because you want to be very professional, obviously you have that relationship, but she said, I wouldn't have even known you two were married. So I think that's good. Because we try to be very much professional, and sometimes we disagree. We, in meetings, we have different opinions on things, and try to work on that. But that has given us incredible ability to continue our scholarship and kind of the historical inquiry, but then to also understand that we have those 2 full-time jobs. And I would say again, this was almost 10 years in, having after we graduated from grad school. And I do talk about perseverance and dedication, because there were many moments that we were like, do we still try this? How do we work this? And we gave it 10 years, and it did finally kind of come our way, but it was not always easy, and it did take a long time. So again, some of my students like, wow, that's a long time to be dedicated to something. And I think, again, it's just because we both really believed in how important historical identity is, about our country, our values here. How do we pass that on to future generations? What happens if historical location or site is lost, right? I mean, that history is lost. It's never recovered again. So I think we both felt pretty passionate about trying to do that and continue to do that. And we've been very fortunate in that regard. And students are, at the Richard Marine Academy. So this is a federal service academy. So we have, there's a quota system in looking at applications because they want to make sure the entire United States is represented at the school. So oftentimes what happens is there are a lot of students from New York who apply because it's closer, but they don't always all get in because they're also bringing students from across the country and from California and from Texas, and so the whole country is represented there with that. And I do find they're coming in and they are thinking very seriously because they want to serve their country. And we talk about what percentage today of the American population is serving in the military, and I think it's around 1%. Mm-hmm. And so they also are thinking about things in a very mature way and understanding that sacrifice is going to entail not having always the freedom to be with family and do that. And so I think we take that pretty seriously and have been able to serve our country in this capacity, even though I've never been in the active duty military myself, but I feel very proud that we've been able to work with these great young men and women to help them on that journey. And every once in a while I get an email from one of the grads, which is great. And a couple of weeks ago I got from one of my former students, they're just filming like we just saw the buoy for the USS Monitor, and we're just going by that and we saw that. I thought of your class and I want to let you know. So that's been very nice. And we do incorporate a lot of leadership lessons in historical case studies. And of course they're reading about different time periods and different men and women and decisions they've made, and that also helps them to think about their own leadership and to grow a little bit, I think, in that way. So that's been a really fun, intellectually fun way to look at things. But often it is kind of, I can't believe it. So we've now been at the academy for 11 years, and I'm sort of stunned by that as well, how long we've been there.
So I know in my own life, I live in Los Angeles. I live in West Los Angeles. A good example is last night I was at an event, a charitable event. There were 1,200 people there. And as far as I know, I was the only veteran in the room, right? Yes. And many of the people who knew me knew, I had been in the Navy. And they find it somewhat difficult to cross what we, that sort of military civilian divide, right? And I see that, I've seen that throughout the 14 years that, I was in the military, both, active duty and reserves. And it's one of my, I don't know what you would call it, but I've worked all my career to help bridge that divide, because it's not like it was 75 years ago where whatever, you had 16 million people in uniform at a time when there was not even 160 million people in the country, right? So 10-12% of people were in uniform, not to mention all the people who worked for the DoD and worked in defense, all that kind of stuff, right? So how have you seen, and you mentioned, I think neither you nor your husband were ever in the military. So how has that aspect impacted, maybe not so much your career per se, but you were teaching at the Citadel, which is also very military oriented. Obviously the Merchant Marine Academy, very military oriented as well. How has that issue affected the dynamics of your work, as a professor, as someone who mentors and counsels students? Would you talk about that a little bit? Yeah,
I think there always is a bit of a tension between sort of civil military pull, between one and the other. I think the issue of certainly of kind of respecting people's decision that they are going to serve their country and the sacrifices that entails, I think that is well worth keeping in mind. There are times, of course, I don't always personally agree with some of the decisions that were made, but kind of understanding that, again, the kind of the larger concerns in terms of defense and kind of decision making, and especially at the academy, very much like how do you support overseas operations? How do you support sea lift operations? That you have to have a merchant marine to be able to support, troops that are being sent overseas. And so that becomes kind of a bigger picture with that. So we have tried to be very respectful and appreciative and kind of understanding the larger mission that we are supporting, right, through our positions. And then again, sometimes personal feelings, kind of one way or the other. That's not something I would necessarily bring into the classroom, to discuss with students. They're certainly intellectual and critical and can analyze and also make decisions on that in terms of like administrative policy and things like that. But I think just understanding that maybe while that's not a decision that you would make in terms of serving, to be very respectful of those who have made that decision. And we have continued to try here. And again, I would think, again, sort of at the younger level, to talk about the importance of what that has had in terms of our history, like for those who have served and what the impact of that is for us who have not, and how we maintain the democracy in the United States. And so that has been a big topic that we like to emphasize. And especially again, kind of looking at my son's middle school, and I've encouraged our Department of Naval Science chair to go in for a career day as well. And I talked to him afterwards about that, and he said, yeah, I'm always surprised. He said, because again, 12 and 13-year-olds, they've never even thought about the military as a possible career. Mm-hmm. And it's not sort of one way or the other. It's not like, supporting it or not supporting it. It's like, it's not even a thought. And so we've been active in trying to kind of bring that as well. There are possibilities and there are ways to serve your country. And we do have a number of students who also serve in the Coast Guard upon graduation. So kind of just looking at the variety of options open. So I've tried to balance the civil military aspect of that. But I think, again, just respecting the fact that, what we ask our military to do and the sacrifices to make so that we can maintain the democracy in the United States, I think is a really key emphasize what we emphasize and what we really try to teach both our, the students who are at the college, but also students that we encounter, especially, in the community as well. And that there's not always this kind of understand, like in Charleston, there's sort of a larger percentage of South Carolinians who were serving in the military, and there was a sort of a stronger connection. And I would say in New York, it's a smaller percentage, and there's sort of not as much knowledge and kind of information about like what the academy does and the graduates and what they're doing. So we're just trying to be ambassadors for that, because we live in the community, but we also work here. So we've tried to, over the last couple of years, really help expand that discussion.
And I know from the service members' perspective, I've encountered many who were anywhere from, dismissive of the so-called, civilian support, thank you for your service. They view that as being, not genuine, to right. Openly hostile to civilians. Mm-hmm. And I oftentimes will at least attempt to counsel them, okay, we take an oath to defend the Constitution, but are we really, it's a piece of paper, that we're defending, or is it what that paper stands for, which is our fellow citizens and have, as you pointed out, our democracy, et cetera. And is the defense of our country, does it have meaning outside of the defense of our fellow Americans, right? So I'm wondering, how do the students respond to you, as a civilian, and as a civilian who is teaching, military history, right? It's like, well, I could imagine some of them would say, egregious things like, who are you to be, teaching this? What do you know about it? That kind of thing. So.
Absolutely. No, I know that's an excellent point, because sometimes you have to win a little trust, and sometimes that takes a little bit of time. But I think one of the things that surprises them, and I'm very, very personally sort of proud of a program that we set up at the Academy. It is a staff ride program to visit Gettysburg National Battlefield. And, kind of growing up, I had a lot of exposure there. what has surprised me at Kings Point, so we're in New York, so it's about a 4-hour drive when I take students there. And we typically will stay the weekend at Gettysburg and then come back. And so I had first broached this idea. So my thought was that we would take a small group of seniors, who are about to step into leadership positions. We would take a small group down and, stop at a couple of points on the battlefield and kind of talk about leadership lessons that transcend time period, right? And sort of what was happening in these areas and who was making decisions and why were they making decisions and how, what would you do in this particular moment? And the initial proposal I put through was met with skepticism, to be honest. And some of the students were very skeptical. And to be honest, there were some administrators who were a little bit skeptical, like, I don't know, this doesn't seem, they're going to be, officers on board these container ships, and that's not really what we do. And then I had an ally, to be honest, in the Alumni Association. And the Alumni Association, the class of 1962, made a very generous donation to the Academy, and they wanted to see some of their funding used for professional development and for leadership development. And I said to them, I think we can use this as leadership development because we're going to look at difficult decisions, how they're made, what were the consequences, and do we see decisions that come up currently that are kind of similar, and how do we make that? So they generously funded the first trip. The students were, I don't know, they used the term voluntold. I don't like that term, but there was some persuasion. You're going on the weekend. I mean, they were happy to get off campus, don't get me wrong, but they're like, we don't know what we're doing, what's happening, what does she want us to do? We have to read a book. And of course, the book I selected was Michael Shar's The Killer Angels, which was it's a beautiful narrative of the Battle of Gettysburg from sort of a senior leadership perspective. And it's historical fiction. The people are factual, but then we don't know exactly the conversations they were having. So they had to read before they went down. And it was a transformative moment once we got there, because I think I kind of sent you one of the images of one of our groups. I would typically ask, we take somewhere around 20 students, and I would ask, has anyone ever been here before? And typically out of 20 students, we would have 2 students say, oh yes, like my parents took us there, or my high school raised money and we went to Gettysburg in Washington our senior year and we sort of saw this. I was like, okay, this is good. But I was actually surprised how low that number was. Okay, so when we got there, then we'll do a couple different stops and we will sort of talk about what was happening that particular day, that particular time, what did people know on each side, and then how do they make decisions? And all of a sudden, you could start to see, they're thinking about this in a little bit different way. And of course, one of the favorite stories we talk about is that many of the corps commanders in the Union Army were in fact West Point graduates. And so they had sort of a similar way of doing things. And there's a comfort level when you work with people who have a similar approach to you, right? But why is it important to bring someone who doesn't have a similar approach in? And of course, one of the corps commanders is not a West Pointer, and he's in fact a Democrat, a lawyer from New York by the name of Daniel Sickles. And Sickles, of course, is doing everything completely differently than everyone else is. And why is it important to get to know everyone on your team, right? To have everyone at the table for lunch, right? And even if you don't like someone, why do you need to bring them into your team and start working and seeing like what ideas like they're sharing, what ideas you're sharing? But if you don't like someone or you don't think the same way and you want to exclude them, all of a sudden this can have rather disastrous results, as of course happens at Gettysburg when Sickles decides he himself is going to position his corps and not really communicate this to the Union General Meade. And so all of a sudden they start to think about and I say to them, who do you have lunch with? Are you just sitting with everyone else who's on, the football team or the soccer team or the basketball team? Why aren't you sitting with some of your other classmates? How are you going to bring them into your team? How are you going to form that? And then, you could just see all of a sudden they start to really to think about what are those decisions and what kind of consequences do they have? And, am I leaving talented people out of this equation just because I'm much more comfortable just to sit with folks that I already know and who already think like me. And maybe it's a good idea to have some diversity in that as well. So all of a sudden you just kind of see them starting to think about things. And for me personally and professionally, those trips have been really a high point for me, because we come back from there and they're excited in a way they weren't before, because they don't know what to expect. And thinking about things differently and talking about it, and then we'll kind of go around the room at the end, or have dinner together at the end, and so what did you learn from this? What did you take away from it? And it's not so much about the events, but all of a sudden thinking about, how do I build a team? What are my expectations? How do I communicate my expectations to a team? What information do I have? Am I making decisions on the best information I have? And all of a sudden, like that really starts together for them, and it's exciting to see that moment. So I appreciate the class of 62 has done great service. I think we have won hearts and minds that way. Because all of a sudden they're like, hey, are you going to Dr. Spielman's trip to Gettysburg? And that's been really a proud professional moment for me. And I knew you started this initially. I am really quite sort of honored to have been elected vice president of our society. And that's a tremendous professional honor. We kind of oversee that, and we do publication of our quarterly journal and our membership meetings and supporting military history. But I'll tell you, you also get a group of 20 young people together out on that battlefield. And, that's why I keep doing this, and why I've really enjoyed this. And I've been fortunate and lucky, but I still love it. So I think I will continue for another couple of years at least, and see how things sort out with that. But that's been a very, very proud professional accomplishment that we've been able to continue that program.
That's wonderful. Unfortunately, the time just zoomed by. We just got a couple of minutes left. I want to take a couple of minutes, as I typically do, and see if we can kind of summarize some of the key points that you've brought out, over the course of your professional arc. One of them is the early immersion in reading, and how that stimulated you intellectually, opened your horizons, so to speak, it sounds like, and you had that encouragement from your grandmother, it sounds like from your parents as well, and how important that is for children to be immersed in that. So I think that's a key point that you brought out. I think that the second one that struck me was, you were coming through the military history, funnel, if you will, at a time when there were very few women in it. I think there's probably still not a whole lot of women in military history. But it sounds like, between connecting with the women that were there, but also, looking beyond to the men that were there as mentors as well, that didn't seem to hamper your progress, but you were able to work with them, and together they enhanced your progress, whether they, and this is kind of taking it all the way to the end. Just because someone doesn't, isn't my same, gender or my same whatever, we can have mentors from many, and sometimes those mentors are better. They challenge us in a different way that perhaps, someone who's more like us wouldn't challenge us. Mm-hmm. So I think that's another key point. A third was just, kind of your perseverance. Like, you're going to give it 10 years. You think of it, 10 years now seems like forever, especially when you're in your 20s. That's like another half of your life, right? But I mean, that you mentioned you got lucky. We can argue, perseverance versus luck, but luck doesn't seem to come without perseverance most of the time, right? And finally, you were really, I think people think of academia as being a place where you don't take professional risks. And yet my assessment of your career is there were, at least 2, 3, 4, maybe sort of calculated professional pivots that you took that were risks, and you worked very hard at them, and they ended up paying dividends, huge dividends in how much you've enjoyed your career thus far, and how you've been able to help your students, help your family, and I think that we shouldn't overlook that. Even in fields where we think, well, there's not a lot of risk in this, and maybe being a lawyer or accountant or whatever, so those are a sure way to success, but there's still sort of points where we need to make those decisions and maybe taking the sort of road less traveled, to borrow a phrase, or the riskier path, maybe that is the better way to go, because it affords us greater opportunity. So have I missed anything, do you think, in what you've said, or has that been a summary?
I think that's an incredible summary. Absolutely. And it's really an amazing moment to kind of look back on that 25 years, and think like, wow, here I am, but we've covered a lot of territory, and exciting about where the next several years are going, and wonder too if maybe there's another, like, one final kind of risk taking coming up there. Maybe I don't know, but we'll see how it goes. But it's been an incredible journey, and just thinking back on the people I've had a chance to meet, the young people I've had a chance to work with, and feeling, like, energized through them. And that's a really neat thing. Although I'm feeling my age a little bit sometimes when I'm out on those trips with them. They're like, I'm going out here. I'm like, okay, I'm going to bed, but I'll see you tomorrow morning. Thanks.
Well, Jennifer, I want to thank you so much for coming on the show. Just your story is so wonderful. Like so many of my guests, we could probably talk for another, several hours, and unfortunately the time is up. But thank you, and hopefully we'll check in with you down the road and see, kind of where life is taking you and your family and your professional endeavors, and kind of get an update from you at some point. But thank you very, very much. Just to wrap up, it's for me to kind of thank my muse. Those of you who have seen the show before, that I was very close to my friend Marie, who is been up in heaven now for a few years, and she was the epitome of a gracious lady, and someone that I still miss on an everyday basis. And so, kind of in tribute to her, Marie, I just want to remind you, darling, you are still my belle. So Jennifer, again, thank you so much for coming on the show. Thank you, all of you, for watching or joining us here on the show, and we will see you next week. All the best.
Thank you. Thanks.